Hi, my name's Ollie, and in this Politics Explained video, I'm going to go through everything you need to know about federalism and debates about the US Constitution in A-level politics. I'm going to start by looking at the parts of the specification this video covers, before going into some of the key questions you could get asked, so both 12 markers and essay questions on this topic in the exam. I'm then going to give an introduction to federalism in the United States, including what federalism is, how power is divided between the states and federal government, and its relationship to limited government. I'm then going to look at the development of federalism over time, looking at the key stages of federalism, as well as federalism under recent presidents. I'm then going to look at federalism in practice, with a number of key case studies, before looking at the debate about the extent to which the USA remains federal today. And then going to move away from federalism a little bit just to wrap up the Constitution and federalism topic. This is the third of 3 videos. I'm going to look at how democratic the US Constitution is and its overall strengths and weaknesses, before looking at how the Constitution shapes US policies today. So, starting off with the parts of specification this lesson covers. So this covers federalism, limited government, and main characteristics of US federalism, as well as the kind of key interpretation debates around the US Constitution and federalism, so the extent to which it's still federal today, as well as some overall debates about the US Constitution. In terms of questions you can get asked, all of these 12 markers and past essay questions are for the whole of the Constitution and federalism topic, and this video is effectively going to be useful for all of them. So looking at the overall similarities between the constitutions, the sources, the principles, differences between devolution and federalism, as well as a lot of these essay questions. So ones including the overall strengths and weaknesses, the extent to which the US Constitution is effective at achieving the principles set out by the Founding Fathers. Federalism is one of those principles. Also got the extent to which the US Constitution is democratic, and one specifically on federalism, and how effective the federalism is maintained today, and how effectively state power is protected today by the Constitution. So, starting off, we're going to have a look at an introduction to federalism. So firstly, what is federalism? So federalism is a structure of politics and government in which power is divided between a national government and state governments, both of which have significant control over clearly defined areas of government. So when we talk about federal government in the US, that means the central government. So it's between the federal central government and the states. The power of states is protected from federal government encroachment by the Constitution and amendment process. And importantly, all states have the same level of decision-making power as each other. The Founding Fathers intended federalism to be a middle ground between a strong central government and protecting the rights and sovereignty of states, and therefore the rights and sovereignty of the people, as they saw it. Federalism isn't explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, the word federalism at least. However, it's implied through how the Constitution sets out the powers of the federal government and their limits. The articles of the Constitution explicitly set out the enumerated powers of the different branches of federal government, as well as the concurrent powers that both the states and federal government have, including the power to tax. And then the 10th Amendment clearly seeks to protect the power of the states by reserving all powers not given to the federal government to the states. The Supreme Court, as the interpreter and enforcer of the Constitution, also clearly takes on the role of arbitrating between the states and federal government when disputes arise. In terms of how power is divided between the states and government, in terms of different powers, so we've looked in the previous video at the key federal government powers, which are of course all split between Congress, the presidency, and the judiciary. In terms of shared powers, you've got maintaining law and order, levying taxes, borrowing money, chartering and regulating banks, establishing courts and providing for the public welfare. And key state powers include establishing and maintaining schools, establishing local governments, regulating business within the state, making marriage laws, providing for public safety, conducting elections, and all other powers not delegated to the national governments. That's through the 10th Amendment. Limited government is linked to federalism. So this is another principle of the US Constitution. And this is the idea that the government will only do what's essential. So it's a really key classical liberal idea, which really influenced the Founding Fathers when they were drafting the US Constitution. And the key goal of limited government is to respect the rights and freedoms of individuals and leave them largely alone. So, a quick level look at now is the development of federalism in the United States and its development over time. So the first thing to note is that federalism isn't static, it's developed and evolved as America has. especially in the latter part of the 19th century, the first two-thirds of the 20th century, a range of factors led to the remit and power of the federal government increasing and expanding, and in many cases expanding into areas that were controlled by states. And there are a number of reasons for this federal expansion. So the Great Depression, huge economic downturn that affected all of the states from 1929, in particular with mass unemployment, as you can see here. Only the federal government, in reality, led by FDR's New Deal, had the resources to reverse the economic downturn, for example, through great public works schemes. So you saw the federal government's role in local business and local economies expanding because of the real need to tackle such a massive economic downturn and its consequences in terms of unemployment. Foreign policy was also really important. So starting with World War II, the US played a much more interventionist role in global affairs, and it's never really stopped in the second half of the 20th century, becoming a global superpower. And the increased importance of foreign policy and participation of the US military in wars inevitably led to the federal government becoming more high profile and powerful, and just having to have a lot more funding as well, become a lot larger. Supreme Court judgments also played an important role. So through the majority of the 20th century, the Supreme Court took a very liberal and expansive approach to the implied powers in the Constitution, in particular the Necessary and Proper Clause, or also known as the Elastic Clause, and the Commerce Clause. This allowed the federal government to increase its power and reach into areas that had previously been controlled by the states, in particular by a lot of things being defined as interstate commerce. A number of constitutional amendments were also really important. For example, the 14th Amendment, which transformed the federal-state relationship, as they were used by the Supreme Court to strike down state laws on segregation and other racial discrimination. And they've also been used to strike down countless state laws, including those restricting abortion. This was prior to the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And the 16th Amendment also increased the power of federal government in relation to the states by allowing the federal government to impose an income tax on individuals within states. Population growth was also important. As the population grew, it required an enlarged central government to manage it, as more states were brought into the US. Also industrialization, a lot more kind of joined up, integrated economy, and improvements in communication from railways to the internet meant that kind of the economy and life of individuals were effectively a lot more interlinked across state boundaries. And ultimately, because there was increased interstate communication and commerce, it required the federal government to manage it. In terms of, there's a number of key kind of phases in the development of federalism, each with different names that can be really useful to bring into your essays and understand. So from 1787 to 1920s, there's what's been called as dual federalism. And this is effectively federalism as originally intended by the Founding Fathers. So there's a very clear divide between the areas the state had jurisdiction over and the areas the federal government controlled. And each area of policy was largely controlled by either the federal government or the states, with little complication or cooperation. And states exercised the most political power, and there was little regulation of the economy by the federal government. What you had then, starting with the Great Depression and FDR's New Deal, was the cooperative federalism from the 1930s to the 1960s. And this is when the federal government significantly increased and expanded its reach with a wide range of national programs and regulations in order to bring America out of the economic slump it found itself in. So federal government in this period became a lot more involved in policy areas traditionally controlled by the states, as they worked together in a range of areas. So Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society program actually then continued this in the mid-1960s, increasing federal spending hugely for a program of economic reforms and welfare schemes to tackle poverty, poor medical care, and poor housing. And this was in particular with the introduction of Medicare. States were given a lot of federal money to tackle unemployment and a range of other issues in this period, and they were therefore responsible for administering many of the national regulations and programs. And this money often came in the form of categorical grants, though, in which the federal government specified how the state government could use it. And this cooperative federalism was primarily under Democrat presidents. 1970s to the 1990s, when there were mainly Republican presidents, you had what was called as New Federalism, starting with President Nixon, and this saw a shift mostly under the Republican president, as I said. And it sought to give more power over how money should be sent back to the states. And this was done rather than through categorical grants, instead through block grants, in which the federal government would give states money that they could use however they wished within the remit for broad policy areas such as education or policing. Much of this attempt to devolve more power back to the states was undermined by the fact that the size of most grants were reduced, and there was an increased use of unfunded mandates, using which the federal government would mandate the states to do certain things without providing any funding for it. So a little bit of an extent to which that state autonomy wasn't completely promoted, but I think the idea was decreased size of the state generally, and a bit more autonomy for the states with block grants. Since the 1990s, it can be seen as effectively the period of federalism can be seen as a zigzag federalism, where more power and autonomy has been given to states in some areas, but in other areas the federal government has exercised stricter control. And the development of federalism has also largely been affected by events and partisanship in this period, as seen below in relation to the four most recent presidents, which we'll now have a look at. So, in relation to Bush, it's really interesting to first see the intention at the start of his premiership or prior to his becoming president, and then the reality. So he entered the presidency in 2001, like most Republican presidents do, with a promise to shrink federal government spending and give lots more power back to the states, really supportive of federalism. In reality, by the end of his presidency, he presided over a huge expansion over the size of federal government and the amount of its spending. So it grew 33% in Bush's first term and continued to be very high in his second term. And this was crucially due to events. So a massive increase in national defense spending in response to 9/11, and economic spending in response to the financial crash in 2008, and also his policies, though, education and Medicare in particular. So, firstly, there was a massive increase in spending with the pursuit of the war on terror in response to 9/11. And so, defense spending increased 125% between 2001 and 2009, and it certainly wasn't low in the first place. Homeland security spending also increased from $30 million in 2001 to $69 million in 2006, more than a 5x increase. And after the 2008 financial crash, Bush also increased the size of the federal government in its spending by taking control over two private mortgage companies and sponsoring a $700 million bailout package for Wall Street banks. Whilst this did represent a huge increase in spending, it didn't encroach on the states. The spending was in areas largely controlled by the federal government, but it can be seen as moving away from limited government and really increasing the size of the state. In terms of policies, the first is in terms of education reform, which Bush pursued with the No Child Left Behind Act, which introduced major changes to education policy, with the federal government's role in this area, traditionally controlled by the states, significantly increasing. So Bush mandated that states test children annually with a uniform national test and provided a 20% increase in funding for the poorest schools. And in 2003 as well, Bush signed a law which significantly expanded Medicare, including a new prescription drug benefit. It was estimated to cost $400 billion in its first 10 years, and it was a significant expansion in the size of the federal government, and was hence opposed by a number of Republicans. So 7 Republican senators and 25 Republicans in the House opposed the measure. Then, if we move on to Obama, see, Obama's administration's intention to deliver change in domestic policy resulted in the federal government again playing an increased role in the areas of policy traditionally reserved for the states. So federal government assistance to states increased from 3.7% of GDP in 2008 to 4.6%. That says 2008. I think that should be 2010. With £246 billion of Obama's economic stimulus package in 2009 going to or through the states, compared to just $20 billion of Bush's in 2008. So government assistance significantly increased, and spending went into healthcare and education in particular, with the expansion of Medicaid and the reauthorization of states' children's health insurance program and the Race to the Top education program. And the expansion of Medicaid to more Americans requires states to either join it or lose federal funding for their existing Medicaid provision. This was a federal mandate. A controversial increase in federal power over health that was challenged in court by some Republican states and then struck down as unconstitutional in 2012. So that can be seen, whereas with federalism was arguably threatened but then protected by the Constitution. In terms of Trump, in some areas he sought to encroach on federal power, whilst in other areas sought to grant more power back to the states. And I think this is a reflection of the fact that the period can be kind of defined by zigzag federalism. So rather than by any kind of ideological attempt to increase or decrease federalism, it was largely dependent on which helped deliver his policy. So in response to Black Lives Matter protests, Trump deployed federal troops to tackle the protests, despite several states opposing it, and policing being an area of policy traditionally controlled by the states. Then Trump rolled back a lot of Obama-era environmental policies with the intention of reducing the effectiveness of environmental legislation and handing power over these policies back to the states. Again, though, under Trump, federal spending and the size of the federal deficit continued to increase, in large part due to the response to COVID and the $2.2 trillion CARES Act. This being said, he did largely leave responsibility for dealing with COVID to the states, with Democrat states pursuing lockdowns and mask mandates, and Republican states being far more relaxed. Trump promised in the 2016 campaign to cut so much of the federal government, your head will spin, and he succeeded in doing so by introducing the first reduction in the federal workforce since the 1990s through a reduction in political appointees. So in some ways, he reduced the size of the state, in other ways, in terms of the number of appointees, but the size of the state in terms of economic its spending and size continued to increase. In some areas, he increased encroachment in terms of over federalism. In some areas, he pulled back. It wasn't really a concerted effort. In terms of Biden so far, it isn't yet clear, but there are a couple of things worth noting. So significant parts of the Inflation Reduction Act, passed in 2001, require federal-state cooperation to implement, such as federal grants to address air pollution and improve the energy efficiency of homes. And tensions between the federal government and Republican states remain high, with several Republican states seeking to thwart Biden's gun control proposals by passing laws banning the enforcement of federal firearm statutes. And there's also been significant tensions, as we'll look at in future videos, between Texas in particular and other southern states and the federal government in relation to immigration and the border war with Mexico. Okay, so what we're going to have a look at now is federalism in practice today, starting by looking at case studies of federalism in practice. So first one of these is COVID-19. As I said, when looking at Donald Trump's response to federalism, a lot of the control over the response to COVID was given to the states. And its impact can be seen in the fact that there was significant variation between the states, and the federal government's ability to dictate policy was very limited. So Democrat-led states imposed far more stringent policies, including mask mandates and lockdowns. The Republican states, particularly during the first year of the outbreak. So California's mask mandate ended in March 2022, compared to Texas's, which ended a year earlier in March 2021. There was some effective federal government policy, in particular the CARES Act, which included $300 billion in one-time cash payments to individuals and families. Once he became president, Biden tried to develop a more effective and thought-out strategy for tackling COVID than Trump had, but struggled with the lack of federal power. So he couldn't impose lockdowns or a nationwide mask mandate, and was limited to actions such as imposing a mask mandate in federal government buildings and on public transport. So that really shows how federalism was effectively working, and limited government in particular was working. With the lack of effective federal policy and significant variation between the states could be seen as a key reason for the US's relatively high death per capita from COVID. The legalization of cannabis is also a really good example of federalism in practice and variation in policy. So the use and possession of cannabis is still technically illegal under federal law due to the 1970 Controlled Substances Act, which should trump laws legalizing cannabis due to the supremacy clause in the Constitution. Despite this, many states have legalized cannabis because the Obama administration stated that they would allow it and wouldn't fund federal government application of the law. And the Obama administration thought that states would be a useful laboratory to test the effectiveness of the policy. And today, 38 states have legalized the medical use of cannabis, whilst 23 states have legalized the recreational use of cannabis as well. And California has legalized the recreational and medical use of cannabis. Florida, for example, has legalized just medical use, and Texas has legalized neither. Sanctuary cities are another really good example. So they're cities that prohibit local law enforcement from helping federal immigration officials to identify illegal immigrants, unless those immigrants have been charged with a serious crime. Today, there are over 600 sanctuary cities in the US, including California as a whole being a sanctuary state. And they represent the power of the states to resist federal power and resist federal immigration officials in particular. In 2017, President Trump signed an executive order that withheld federal grants to sanctuary cities. However, is declared unconstitutional, and its implementation was stopped in November 2017. And this shows how the 10th Amendment of the Constitution protected state power, as judges interpreted it as preventing the federal government from commandeering state governments to do something, and they weren't given the power to do in the Constitution. Final key example is the Affordable Care Act. So the legal, and it's in particular the legal development in relation to it and its relationship to the Supreme Court after it was passed in 2010. And this can be used to show both the resilience of state power and the extension of federal power. So on the one hand, the Supreme Court struck down one of the Affordable Care Act's provisions as unconstitutional in its 2012 ruling. After attorney generals in 27 states filed lawsuits. So it's actually the states who were challenging the policy themselves. So the ACA's requirement that states expand Medicaid or lose their existing federal funding for Medicaid programs was declared to be an unconstitutional overreach of federal power and was struck down. And as a result, states could still not expand Medicaid and keep their existing Medicaid funding after this ruling. On the other hand, they upheld the majority of the ACA, including in 2015 when they judged that if states refused to run health insurance exchanges, the federal government was allowed to step in and do so. And this represented support for significant federal power over states. What we'll have a look at now is the consequences of federalism. So first, significant variation in culture, policy and ideology between states on a wide range of issues, including education, marriage, drugs and the death penalty. This can be seen in the differences in relation to cannabis, sanctuary cities and COVID-19 I mentioned. Across states, there's also a big difference in terms of culture and ideology and demographics, which have a significant bearing on political support. So the Deep South, including Texas, is more conservative, more likely to support the Republican Party, though Texas is actually increasingly becoming a swing state. Whilst the Northeast, including New York, is more liberal and likely to support the Democrats. States can also be seen as policy laboratories, so they can experiment with new policies and solutions, which means that federal government laws are sometimes first tried in states. So Alaska implemented a universal basic income, which presidential candidate Andrew Yang advocated for implementing at federal level in 2016. This can also be seen in the Affordable Care Act in 2010, which was modelled on healthcare reform in Massachusetts earlier in 2006. Tensions between states and federal governments are also very significant, particularly states that aren't controlled by the same party as the president. And one of the consequences of this is that legal challenges against the federal laws are often led by the states, and this was seen in the challenges to Obamacare and in the overturning of Roe v. Wade in 2022. There's also significant complications in shared responsibility. So though some areas of policy are controlled exclusively by the states or by federal government, others are shared, and this leads to the administration of certain policies, such as policing and education, now education after Bush's reforms in particular, being complicated. So the tax system, for example, is highly complex due to the fact that income tax is levied by both federal and state governments, as well as kind of property and other taxes varying between the states. And another consequence of federalism is decentralized elections and political parties. So in the US, political parties are decentralized, with 50 Republican parties and 50 Democrat parties, which leads to significant variation and makes it difficult for presidents and central party leaders to control. And this can be seen in elections as well, with each state running their own elections and having their own rules. This is true for including for presidential elections, with the electoral college system. So there's different rules for whether prisoners can vote in each state. For example, in Maine and Vermont, prisoners can, whilst in Virginia, those convicted of a felony can't even vote after leaving prison. The final thing I thought we'd have a look at before looking at the debates is the Democrat and Republican attitudes towards federalism. So in the last century, Democrats have largely been supportive of the extension of federal power, seeing it as necessary to help the whole of society and tackle problems including unemployment and lack of access to healthcare. This can be seen in the New Deal, the Great Society reforms and Obamacare. And all of these programs included categorical grants, according to which the federal government specified how the state governments could use them. Historically, the Republicans have been far more supportive of federalism and protecting state power than Democrats. So Republican presidents, including Nixon and Reagan, during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, sought to decrease the size of the federal government and ensure that when federal money was given to states, it was done so in the form of block grants, which gave states more power and autonomy over how money could be spent within a broad policy area. Okay, so the final thing we're going to have a look at is some debates in relation to federalism and in relation to the US Constitution as a whole. So, first looking at the extent to which the US remains federal today. Starting with arguments that the US does remain federal today, is that the 10th Amendment can be kind of ensures that the power of states are protected from federal overreach, as saw in relation to Trump's executive order in relation to sanctuary cities. There's significant variation in policy, culture, and ideology between the states, and states can act as policy laboratories to improve federal government policy. The very difficult amendment process ensures that the Constitution can't be changed to infringe upon state power without state consent. And states are able to take a different direction to the federal government when they disagree. There's certain Democrat-controlled states have introduced sanctuary cities, which interfere with the implementation of federal immigration laws. And in response to the Affordable Care Act, many Republican-controlled states decided not to accept new federal funding to expand Medicaid, instead keeping their existing Medicaid funding and provision. They're originally not able to do this and challenged it in court until this part of the Affordable Care Act got struck down, and they were able to. US v. Lopez, 1995, which we looked at in the previous video, the first video actually, on the Constitution, looking at its vagueness, marked a shift away from the expansive interpretation of federal power and implied powers that the Supreme Court followed in most of the 20th century. And the vast majority spent by states is raised through state and local taxes, whilst a lot of the federal funding is through block grants, which gives states significant autonomy in deciding how the money can be spent. An example of block grant is the Surface Transportation Program, which states can use to improve and maintain highways, bridges, tunnels, sidewalks, and bicycle paths. In terms of arguments that the USA doesn't remain federal today, or kind of limits to the effectiveness of federalism, is that due to the expansion of federal power in the 20th century, the US can be seen as no longer a federal state. Major federal programs such as the New Deal, Great Society, and Obamacare can be seen as having encroached on policy areas historically controlled by the states, such as healthcare and employment, and including through federal mandates, which impose national policies on all states. And Obamacare and Bush's education policies are good examples of this. Implied powers, in particular the Commerce Clause and Elastic Necessary and Proper Clause, have justified the growth of federal power through the 20th century, whilst constitutional amendments, including the 16th Amendment on income tax, introducing federal income tax, have expanded federal power. Further, states are reliant on the federal government for around a quarter of their income. This allows the federal government to control state policy somewhat, particularly through categorical grants, which specify how money should be spent. So in 1984, for example, Congress passed a National Minimum Drinking Age Act, requiring states to raise their aid for the purchase of alcohol to 21 or lose 10% of their federal highway funds. All 50 states complied, though the law has been seen as sidestepping the 10th Amendment, and this really shows how federal funding can be used to control by the federal government to influence and control state policy. What we're going to finally look at is some debates over the Constitution overall. First, looking at how democratic the US Constitution is and some overall strengths and weaknesses. So firstly, arguments that the US Constitution is democratic is that the amendment process ensures that states and the population are protected against changes they don't support unless there's major support from them across the population. Federalism and the 10th Amendment ensure that states are largely protected from the federal government imposing policies which they oppose. The Bill of Rights ensures that rights are well protected in the Constitution, and the amendment process ensures this is unlikely to be changed. Separation of powers and checks and balances ensure democracy isn't threatened by one branch or individual gaining too much power. And the consequent need for bipartisanship means that under the norm of divided government, policies can only be passed if they're based on compromise and have broad support. Further, elections are very regular and they're controlled by the states, ensuring that the electorate is able to regularly vote out politicians they deem to have failed to represent them effectively. In terms of other strengths of the Constitution that are kind of separate from it being democratic, is that the vagueness of the Constitution and the use of implied powers has allowed the Constitution to modernise in the 20th century without the need for the formal amendment process. And implied powers allow the core principles of the Constitution to be maintained and not threatened, whilst also allowing the document to be practically applied in politics in the 21st century and 20th century. The fact that the Constitution is very difficult to amend ensures its key principles are well protected and that ill-thought-out reactionary amendments fail to be passed. And the fact that the key rules of the US political system are codified in one relatively short document ensures that they're both easily followed and the US population is well informed about their political system and rights. And finally, judicial review enables the Constitution to be flexible and evolve with the changing society and in response to changing political circumstances, even if the formal amendment process allows for little change. In terms of arguments that the US Constitution is undemocratic, It can be argued that the very difficult amendment process is undemocratic because many proposed amendments have majority support from the population, sometimes significant majority support from the population, but can't be passed due to a small majority blocking them due to the need for supermajorities in both Congress and the states, for example, with the Equal Rights Amendment. The power of the federal government has significantly increased over the past century, leading many to suggest that state power is no longer protected from the federal government, and the US political system is no longer federal. Despite the Bill of Rights, it can be argued that the Constitution doesn't adequately protect rights. For example, this can be seen in the Second Amendment facilitating mass loss of life in school shootings. Separation of powers and checks and balances often leads to gridlock under divided government rather than bipartisanship, whilst under unified government, it can be argued there are insufficient checks and balances. And whilst elections are frequent, the Electoral College is undemocratic, and as is states with smaller populations, having equal representation to states with larger populations in the Senate. In terms of other weaknesses of the US Constitution, the use of implied power allows the Constitution to develop and change significantly without the consent of the population, which the formal amendment process would guarantee. And it can be argued that the federal government today is far more powerful than the founding fathers intended and envisaged. The codified and entrenched Constitution gives unelected Supreme Court justices an excessive amount of power in how they interpret the Constitution and allow for change. And the fact that the Constitution is entrenched, the amendment process is very difficult, leads to it failing to modernise and being very outdated. And the final thing we can have a look at in this video and in this whole of this Constitution and federalism topic is how the Constitution shapes US politics today. Firstly, the ability of the Supreme Court to make interpretive amendments through changing how the Constitution is interpreted is highly significant in US politics today, where there's been a shift to a conservative-dominated court in the past decade, which has resulted in a number of highly consequential changes, including the overturning of Roe v. Wade and the declaration that affirmative action in college admissions is unconstitutional, both of which were in 2022. Federalism and the protection of states' rights is a highly relevant part of US politics. States often lead the charge against federal government laws they don't like through lawsuits, such as in the Affordable Care Act. The Electoral College allowed Trump to win in 2016 despite losing the popular vote to Hillary Clinton. So it shows how the Electoral College and the Constitution is really significant. The Bill of Rights and the Constitution in general are highly relevant aspects of US politics, as can be seen in the politically charged nature of the Second Amendment. And the separation of powers and system of checks and balances lead to significant contestation within Washington. Need to gridlock and the need for compromise. So yeah, that's everything in terms of this video. Let me know if you've got any questions or comments in the comment section below, and I'll see you in the next few videos, which will be on Congress.